this Gospel, which talks of the way in which King David went into the temple and ate of the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests, has been used in the whole thematic of who can handle the sacred species. It is sometimes a question which one has to handle, for people come to us with that kind of issue at heart. Often they are people who would be considered to be the most prayerful in a parish situation, and for that reason they would have been invited to become extraordinary ministers. The problem is that sometimes, as their prayer life deepens, they are somewhat puzzled and they see issues which they had not immediately perceived when they go into adoration, and when they observe also what is actually happening in the way in which the easily making available of the Blessed Sacrament to all and sundry, and the handling of it by unconsecrated hands on a massive scale, is actually part of the problem with regard to the loss of faith and reverence in general. And they then become aware that they perhaps are part of the problem. So it is not a simple issue, for they are people of goodwill and often the very best in a parish. However, since at times one is asked to address the issue, it has to be looked at. So in a few words we will examine this issue. Let us collocate it in the wider context, the whole spectrum of history, which, remember, is his story. Now, the Church is a huge entity. It is the mystical body. It is not just an agglomeration of human beings. It is far more than the sum of its members. It is the divine life made available unto man and the salvation of man. It is what has been classically thought of as the Noah's Ark of salvation. Now, in that world history of salvation, there has been a long pedagogy taking place, of which the Old Testament is the central core. A whole education, therefore, to the sacred was there, and certain people doing certain things, certain types of people doing certain things. That was taken on and presumed to be essentially part of the divine pedagogy, also for the fullness of faith and revelation which came with the Incarnation and the creation, as we know it, of the sacramental system. Now, the Church was one, and we must remember our Eastern brethren and the desire of the recent pontiffs that the Church should breathe once again with its two lungs. Therefore, when one wants to see history and unity, one looks first of all at those areas which are unquestioned and which are found in both East and West. Now, until recent times, the discipline regarding the touching of the sacred species was perceived in the same way in East and West. And in the West, when not immediately after Vatican II, but sometime later, we must remember that, new norms did come in, these were perceived by quite a few to be very dangerous and menacing. And we must not forget that the present desire of the Holy Father to heal what is in danger of becoming a split forevermore, a schism, if one likes, in the traditionalist side of Christians in the Catholic Church, is something which is precisely linked with the handling of the divine, because these are people who are very much aware of the radical difference between allowing unconsecrated hands to handle what was until then reserved unto consecrated hands makes in the psychology of a human being, and indeed in the mindset of Christians at large. Therefore, if it is able to provoke things like this, we have to take it seriously also within the discussion of what is our life, even in the West. I mean the Latin Rite. The Latin Rite does not refer to the language Latin so much as to the being under the rite which comes from Rome, as opposed to the Antiochian or whatever it might be in the East. Now, this issue is actually far more complex than one realizes. We must remember that the Holy Spirit does inspire the Supreme Pontiff, and all the recent pontiffs have been very reticent with regard to the issue of wanting Holy Communion to be given normally in the hand. It has been forced upon the Supreme Pontiffs by disobedience. Therefore, it's not the same as something coming from them spontaneously. It has been a damage limitation operation. Therefore, what we have is something which in philosophy one would refer to as the permissive will of God, as opposed to the positive will of God, it would seem. This is something which happens in quite a few sectors, that one comes against pastoral practice which becomes so normal because it has become acceptable as a practice, but which has been quite puzzling in its origin. Therefore, when in adoration we perceive the hurt of the Sacred Heart, and when he puts on individuals' hearts a desire not to banalize and make cheap the most holy and blessed that we have, that grace is to be taken seriously. Quite a few people are receiving it right now. Amongst them also people who earlier on, out of generosity and because of the good testimony of their lives, were invited to become extraordinary ministers. The problem is actually more complex because they then become part of another problem. That communion at that point then becomes what we would say communion on demand, because a layperson cannot refuse or do much about people coming up to Holy Communion whom they know better than the priest to be in strange situations. Therefore, they are part of quite a subtle issue which at first they were not aware of at all. And also the fact that they are themselves, with unconsecrated hands, handling the Blessed Sacrament, is a green light to everyone else to do the same as they come to Holy Communion. And also, they are unable to do anything but one thing, give the Blessed Sacrament. They cannot bless. They can ask the Lord to bless, but they cannot actually confer a blessing. It's only a priest who can bless, for instance, a child, and therefore the whole issue of that sacramental is linked. And we must remember also that in the old rite, Holy Communion is only given after each communicant has received a blessing with the host, because the old rite contains also this sign, while the longer formula for Holy Communion is being pronounced by the priest. Therefore, each person is given a Eucharistic blessing, which, remember, does contain remission of venial sins before that person receives Holy Communion. And if it is a child in the mother's arms, that child can be blessed also with the Blessed Sacrament. A layperson has no right whatsoever to bless with the Blessed Sacrament, and cannot confer a blessing either by tracing the sign of the cross with the intention to bless on the forehead of the child or of any other person who perhaps would make that sign, as it happens often in mixed cultures like England or America, to ask for a blessing. Therefore, what I am saying is this: even though they are people who are trying their best to help by offering service. Actually, if they really do ask the Lord His will for them, and let Him really speak to their heart, He might actually make them aware that the problem is far more complex than they had realized. There is also another issue, unfortunately. It's this, that in the large areas of the world, such as America, I presume Australia, England, where the chalice is also given, we have this other problem coming in there of what happens with the large amount in the chalices that remain afterwards, and there is abuse coming in there. People consuming themselves this, not at the altar because they cannot, because that's where it should be consumed. It's actually in the instructions given quite clearly, even in the missal itself. And then they are there with these chalices full of the precious blood, often on little tables at the side with no corporal to protect it, because the corporal has to be underneath anything where the Blessed Sacrament is, and doing very casual washing up operations without really going through the formula and the way in which it should be done properly, because it is actually part of the rite. Therefore, it's all part of bringing down a notch, the sacred and the other. And from one thing to the other, one bit goes, and each bit going is one bit less for him, a bit more for us, a bit more of the same. We all have the same rights. And then, of course, the very fact that we do not anymore oblige a person to wear an alb or whatever it might be from the beginning if they're going to be at the service of the altar, because acolyte actually means somebody who follows, akolutheim in Greek, follows initially the bishop but then eventually the priest with a lit candle. Now, they would therefore, if the acolyte, because the acolyte initially when they received the powers of the subdeacon, they were made extraordinary, and the word is there, extraordinary ministers. And that could have been useful for the application of the principle of communion under both kinds, holding the chalice, which is, remember, not quite the same as touching the Blessed Sacrament itself, the host, because the chalice is actually what is holding it, even though that is a step as well. But nevertheless, the dignity would be there if the acolyte, the deacon, and the priest alone were in any way close to that area doing sacred other things, whereas people coming from the people in the same dress as they would have in any other occasion, and nowadays it's not always brilliant because men come even without ties, therefore very casually, and all this is more of the same thing, whereas just the visible element of being completely dressed in a different way to do something completely different, which only the angels will perhaps do in our place, and even that is very rare, because when people receive in ecstasy Holy Communion, it is an angel or a miracle directly of telekinesis, where the Lord Himself does it. But it is always taken, of course, from a tabernacle. This is, therefore, what we have to think about and think out, because the whole thing is not discussed. We don't actually scratch deep under the surface to see what all the issues are involved. What one can do is, if one is aware that one is in a situation where one is already acting as an extraordinary minister, and the Lord is making us aware that one is perhaps part of a problem, one has to avoid at all costs getting into a discussion with the parish priest. One has to just use one's rights as an individual to say yes or no, or eventually to withdraw. But remember, the Lord does not judge every person in one same way. He judges us according to our fidelity to what we see and perceive. Therefore, the issue can actually evolve within the framework, within the life of an individual. That an individual can, with greater devotion, become more keenly aware, precisely as they see the way that they are making it easier for people to commit sacrilege. Let us then come with that element of great respect and fear and trembling into a realm which we don't quite perceive. And for our help, what we can do is perhaps look at two things. One is read willingly things which come from our distant past, where people, all people, had also in the West a huge fear and trembling for the sacred. But also to see what is going on within those amongst us in the West who will not compromise, and see what they have to say, for nevertheless the Spirit does speak to people of goodwill of that nature as well, for they have things to say, and we must not cast away, because perhaps things are allowed to happen to remind us. And also to remember the East. The East, nevertheless, it's hugely powerful. If one wants to see history, one looks towards the East, because, thank God, they do not jettison 2,000 years with one stroke of a pen.